processes that have oppressed us. So in short, when you talk about that, you have to also look at things from our perspective, in our perspective, we don't see an American dream. We've been living across generations an American nightmare. And when we talk about this issue of speech, it really begins to raise questions, because sometimes for us, speech has been used as a weapon. In other instances, for us, when we are trying to speak, we are speaking although we feel like we have a muzzle on us. And then sometimes there's speech happening, particularly around issues of race, that feel uninformed, ahistorical, and acontextual. It's almost like playing a game of truth or dare. And if you look up the rules for truth or dare, the person who is on the hot seat is actually not controlling the game. Other people in the game get to decide the parameters of what you share. And that's, again, a lot of what it feels like to be Black in America. When we protest, we're speaking, but that very protest can be turned against us. In the halls of academia, we try to speak our truth, but sometimes that, again, is thwarted. We're muzzled because we have to speak within the prescribed parameters of a discipline that did not have us in mind necessarily. In the pulpit, we try to speak our truth, but then, as what happened with Pastor Wright, if you don't say things in a particular sort of way, it will come back and bite you. We try to speak our truth in the context of movies and media, but sometimes we can't even get in the door. And if we get in the door, it has to be according to a formula of what Black life looks like from the lens of other people. We try to speak our truth within the halls of the politics of America, in the Congress. And it's a very painful place to be. If you talk to Black elected officials of what it feels like and how they're treated in the halls of Congress, it's absolutely shameful. And then we try to speak our truth in the media and as news people and as reporters, and again, can end up getting called all kinds of nasty names. So the assaults to Black folks' dignity and humanity just keep coming and coming. It's a never-ending onslaught that eventually erodes one's sense of well-being, sense of security and safety in the world, even sense of reality. And so we are legitimately tired, we're frustrated, we're skeptically hopeful, we're resilient. But I say skeptically hopeful because every time we seem to have made some kind of gain, trust me, there is a backlash that quickly follows, and things are reversed in very interesting sorts of ways. And so you have this child here saying, stop killing us. And I'm sure you're thinking specifically now about the police murders, but actually the issue goes far beyond that. It's not just the police. Every system that touches our children in this country, literally every system harms them. Every system that harms us as Black people harms us. So how? We're constantly dealing with stereotyping and implicit bias is constantly at play. So with Hurricane Katrina, the Black person is looting and the white couple is finding. Same behavior, same catastrophe, right? When some white young men are charged with committing a crime, they get to wear their Sunday best, or their pictures are in their Sunday best. Same crime, same area of the country, and the mugshots are used. Why? Because it's perpetuating the narrative about who we are as human beings. And the assaults to our dignity and our identity, they begin very, very early in our lives. This is actually a workbook for kids in preschool, 4-year-olds, and they're learning to write. I found this in New Haven, Connecticut. And it's telling us without blatantly telling us, this is who you are, this is who we are. The happy white girl. Now I'm just learning how to print, but I'm also putting together 2 and 2. The proud white boy, the sad Black boy, and of course the angry Black girl. So we're talking about unmitigated racial stress across across history, and it is meted out not just against adults, but against our children. So it's psychic suffocation and trauma that's harming us, but also other communities of color. So the basic premise here is that the fundamental structure of racial oppression is violence that includes psychological violence, and it places our souls under stress. Ultimately, it literally takes our breath away. And history matters, but we're not paying attention. Zora Neale Hurston said the present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell. And there's nothing like an agony inside of you because you cannot tell your own story. So why are we tired? Why are we skeptical? Look at all of the things that have happened to us. We've got constitutional amendments, congressional bills. These are all specific to so-called freeing and leveling the playing field. We've got executive orders, and we've got all of these federal court decisions. But yet and still, here we are, Black folk in America, at the bottom of every good list and the top of every bad list. We've marched, we've litigated, we've legislated, we've prayed, and we've cried, but our gains keep getting undercut. The attacks keep coming. Why? Because of a deadly mindset that since the days of enslavement and before, actually 600 years before, Black people have been seen as less than human. And we are under immense racial and economic, cultural, environmental stress. And in that context, there's a regular de-blackening. We cannot be fully who we are. Instead, we are dealing with prolonged suffering, which is our normal. And people don't stop and take an opportunity to really see us. But it's not enough to just see us. We need you to feel us, to feel the trauma, the stress, the pain, the tenuous hold on hope. It won't hurt after a while. Stuck. But instead, we want to have resilience. Racism, unfortunately, is like shade on our resilience. Why can't we have the sunshine? And just look at how, if you allow music to resonate with your spirit, notice the difference between how you feel now versus how you felt when I played the other song on the previous slide. So we got to go through it to get to it, Black folks. If the rest of the world does not see me, I see myself. And as people of African ancestry, as Black folk, we've had to deal with generations, I mean generations of racism, stereotypes, mistreatment, and discrimination. And it doesn't just take our breath away, it takes our health, our image of ourselves, and our image of each other away. And as Baldwin said, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. But there's a portal open right now, and Black folk are trying to escape, and we're hoping that America will escape with us. And this is what we look like when we're escaping. It's hard work. It is painful. And it's especially compromised by the fact that Baldwin said the American ideal of progress is measured by how fast I become white. And that could include not only just the ideal of progress, but the idea and the standard for how we're supposed to show up in the world and speak our truth. So I'm going to conclude with, we need an aerial Wakandan view. All kinds of stuff matters. Context, history, culture, race, multi-generational trauma, prolonged suffering. And without understanding these, we end up with answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain, and conclusions that don't conclude. But best be assured, realize, 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 which is why we're frustrated, right? We have a broken social contract. And please know, this is not truth. What we do depends on what we see. That's what you would think. It's not the case. What we do depends on what we are socialized and trained to see. And we often don't see each other, let alone feel each other. We see through a lens of bias, and then we try to have conversations. But your perspective plus the perspective of others matters. And when we can get to the place where we appreciate that, we will be making a step in the right direction. Because sometimes you can't see yourself clearly until until you see yourself through the eyes of others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grills, for that perspective. Just bringing that life and that experience to this conversation. Thank you so much. Every time you give a speech, I'm always in awe, so thank you. I would now like to welcome our keynote speaker for the afternoon, Michelle Deutchman. Michelle is the Executive Director of the University of California's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Michelle is a civil rights advocate and scholar with more than a decade of experience advancing free speech as an attorney, instructor, and a key figure in the Anti-Defamation League. Loyola Marymount University is honored to have her with us here today. Michelle.
Michaela, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And of course, I want to thank the Office of Intercultural Affairs and the Associated Students of LMU, the Ethnic and Intercultural Services, and the Division of Student Affairs staff for inviting me to participate in this forum. It is a tremendous privilege to share the Zoom stage with both President Snyder and of course with Dr. Grills. I have never had the privilege of hearing Dr. Grills speak, and I am also in awe. And I think that much of what she discussed is a really perfect introduction to what we're going to talk about visa-free speech, which is that we live in a really flawed system, and that unfortunately, oftentimes anti-racism and other important values are at odds with free speech. But I'm going to posit that I don't think they always have to be conflicting forces. I think that they can use one another to their advantage. I'm always sort of troubled by a national polling where students are asked to choose. Would they rather have a college campus that values free expression, or would they rather have one that values diversity and inclusion, for instance? And I find that to be a false choice and a very concerning narrative, because I don't think that these two things always need to be at odds. You know, free speech is not free, as Dr. Grill said. There is a huge cost to be borne in order to have the kind of speech that we have in our society. And unfortunately, that speech is, that cost is largely borne on the backs of marginalized groups. And I think you have to start any discussion about the First Amendment with that acknowledgement. We're talking about really challenging issues today. I do not come to this forum with answers. I come with hope. I come with the intent to inform you and encourage you to think more broadly and more deeply. And part of my role today is to review the basics of the First Amendment, why we have it, how it protects us, what its flaws are. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can sort of take this First Amendment journey together. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Sorry, technical difficulty. Let me try that again. Okay. Okay, well, the slides are not coming up, which is unfortunate. Sorry about that. Give me one more second.
You got it, Michelle.
It's up? Okay. Everyone can see my screen? Okay. So obviously we're starting with this idea of who's free speech. And I think it's probably not news to anybody that the free speech movement is affiliated very closely with colleges and universities. So that's a picture on the left of my alma mater, UC Berkeley, during the free speech movement, which occurred largely in the 1970s. And of course, tremendous social change has been able to happen because of the fact that we have freedom of speech in this country, of course, culminating most recently in some of the greatest civil unrest the country has seen in the protests, for Black Lives Matter, and, following the deaths and murders of George Floyd and many others. So where do you start? So Alice in Wonderland is one of my favorite stories, and Lewis Carroll has a quote in there that says, you begin at the beginning and you go on until you come to the end and then you stop. And so we're going to start at the beginning. And I really think the place to begin is, where does freedom of speech emanate from? And I realize that this may be a review for some of you. And if it is, then congratulations, you are part of the civically informed part of the country, right? The freedom of speech emanates from the First Amendment. The First Amendment is the US Constitution. It begins, we the people, which of course has tremendous irony considering that the people at that time, many people were not considered people when the Constitution was written, including people of color, including women, there were slaves. So again, we have a flawed document, but I'm a pragmatist. And right now, this is the document that we have to work with. And perhaps someday there may be changes to it. But for now, I think we have to capitalize and utilize what we can. So Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. This is the beginning of the First Amendment. So why Congress? One of the things that I think people sometimes forget about the First Amendment is that it only applies to public entities, right? This is about the government. This isn't about what your parents can say. This isn't about what you can do in your home. This is about the government. And the idea being that we do not want the government, whether it's this administration or any other administration, to be able to decide what we can and cannot say. And of course, the First Amendment and the fact that we have very few restrictions on speech is one of the things that differentiates us from authoritarian and other regimes. So in the First Amendment, there's actually 5 freedoms that are protected. And I'm just gonna ask you in your mind, or if you're next to a pencil and paper, to quickly jot down what you think those freedoms are. Of course, I've given you one of them. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. And you can test yourself and see how you do. Okay, so here are some answers: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government to redress grievances, which I always think is the trickiest one. And of course, I mean, as Dr. Grill and Michaela have referred to, and President Snyder, all of these things are in play right now all around the country. Freedom of speech, protests and rallies, the right to assemble, who can assemble where, how is your assembly potentially chilled if people are coming to protest with weapons, for instance. So one thing I want to note is that we have a kind of a civic literacy problem in the United States. And here's a question. It says, how many of the 1,007 people surveyed by the First Amendment Center last year were able to correctly name all 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment? And I think, yes, we have a poll. So I'm gonna ask everybody just to take a minute and vote. I won't know who voted what. And see what you think. I love that we can see this in real time. And we'll give people some time. I love that there's a good number of people so far that think that 896 people knew all of them. I'll let people, we're still moving. I'll give people another minute. All right. All right, so what you can see is, okay, so nobody thought it was 1,000. 12%, these are the optimists, thought 896 people. Almost 70% thought 25, and then those 20%, unfortunately, have the correct answer, which is that of the 1,007 people that were surveyed, only 6 of them, not 6%, actually only 6 people could name all 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. And the reason that I showcase this is because I think a lot of times that people blame colleges. They say, oh, there's this, free speech issue and it's all happening on college campuses. And I think it's important to remember that people's ideas and understandings of the First Amendment and of democracy begin well before they get to college, right? And when you give students, and as a parent of young kids, you give children this robust sort of training in that words matter and that we shouldn't be using words that can offend or harm. And you don't pair it with civic literacy about what's allowed under the First Amendment, it's no wonder that people are surprised when they get to college. So that was the federal Constitution. And just so you know, the federal Constitution is always what's considered a floor, not a ceiling. Those are the minimum number of rights. State constitutions are allowed to give you more rights. And as you likely know, California, love California for this, loves to give more rights. So someone in California under the California Constitution has even more rights than someone potentially in another state. But California even goes one step further. We have something called Leonard Law. And Leonard Law was passed in the early 90s. And it applies the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which we already talked about, and Article 1, Section 2 of our state constitution to private and public high schools, colleges, and universities. So remember, like a couple minutes ago, I said, usually the First Amendment only applies to public entities. That's except if you're in California and you are a public or private college or university. And that's why we're talking about the First Amendment today. California is the only state to grant First Amendment protections to students at private post-secondary institutions. So that means that even at private universities in California, the US Constitution, the First Amendment will apply. Now, what about private schools in other places in the country? And you can think of any number of private schools, whatever your choice is, or a team that you like. Most private schools, while they're not obligated by the law to abide by the First Amendment, most of them do anyway, because they feel that within their mission to educate and generate robust debate and curiosity and intellect, they need to abide by the rules of the First Amendment. So the difference is that at a private school, they are going to be able to potentially censor speech in a way that you cannot at a public school, or if you are a private school in California. So I hope you're still with me. What counts as speech? People, I think, all too often think that speech is just what you say. There are so many elements to speech. And I could show you a million pictures. And so I think it's important to think broadly about different ways that we might express ourselves. All right, does the First Amendment allow you to say anything you want? I sometimes wish it did, even though if I said everything I wanted, I'd probably be in a ton of trouble. The answer here is no. This is not an absolute unlimited right. And I've put up one of the kind of key examples that's often, showcased, which is that you're not allowed to falsely cry fire in a crowded theater. Because if you do that, then it's going to make people panic. They're all going to try to get out, and potentially it's going to incite this sort of illegal action, and people might get hurt. Now, there are a list of things that are not protected by the First Amendment, and they're here: fighting words, obscenity, defamation, invasion of privacy, threats, incitement to illegal activity, and harassment. So I would be happy at another point in time to come back and talk about these unprotected parts of the First Amendment. But today we're really going to focus on what is protected, because I think the hardest question really isn't the question of what speech is protected. I think the hardest question is, when you have ugly speech that is protected, how do we respond? And that's where we're going to go right now. So I think we have another poll, which is true or false. This poster from a protest says hate speech is not free speech. And I think we have a poll that's going to come up that is going to ask you to vote on true or false. But if not, I will, oh, there it is. So go ahead. Hate speech is not free speech. Okay, so what we have is basically a tie almost. We have 51% of people saying it's false and 49% of people saying it's true. And in this case, it's going to be the people who voted false that have it. And this is, I think, showcases. I think I can hear someone speaking, not on mute. Sorry about that. Oops, I didn't mean to do that yet. Okay. Basically, we have free speech in order to protect ugly speech. That's sort of one of the fundamentals of the First Amendment. And it's one of the fundamentals that many people don't understand. As you can see, 50% of the people, didn't get it right. So I think there's a couple of issues. The first is just understanding how the First Amendment works. And I want to be very clear. I'm not in any way saying whether I think hate speech should or should not be protected. I'm just stating a fact, which is that within our constitutional jurisprudence right now, in the world that we are operating in, hateful speech is protected. And because of that, we're going to talk about why that is, and then we're going to talk about how do we respond to that. I'm going to show a couple of images. I just want to let people know have some hateful ideas on them, but I think it's really important for people to see specifically what kinds of things are protected speech, as much as we may abhor the viewpoints. Okay, it may be things about the Confederate flag, might be something like Holocaust denial, which by the way is punished in many countries in Europe. And then all of these flyers are actually flyers that were found on college campuses. I would say like in the last 18 months, there has been a tremendous increase in the targeting of colleges and universities by white supremacists. So most of the people that are hanging up these flyers on campus are not part of the campus community, but that doesn't matter because the impact is still the same. So in the world that we live in, you're allowed, if you're putting it up in an area where posters are allowed to hang, you are allowed to hang a really ugly, hateful, offensive, despicable flyer. So my third question for the group is there a legal definition of hateful speech? And I'm going to again have you vote yes or no. Okay, again, we have it fairly close with 44% saying yes and 56% saying no. So in this case, the answer is no, okay? And one of the things I'm gonna ask now is why is there no legal definition of hate speech? And I want you to spend a minute thinking about that. It's not a poll question. And the main reason is because what is hateful is very subjective. And I'm sure we can all think of examples of this in our own lives. I can tell you that sometimes my husband and I sit and watch a television show and he's literally laughing hysterically. And not only do I not think it's funny, but I actually think it's offensive. And I'm always sort of struck by that because he and I, have so similar values on so many things. And so the question would be, who do we want to write this definition of hate speech? And how are we ever going to agree on it? And again, do you want the government to be writing a definition of hate speech? And I think most people are going to argue that they do not want the government to be writing the definition of hate speech. And what free speech advocates will tell you, it is that by allowing the ugliest speech, we're able to protect all kinds of speech, especially speech that leads to social change. So I want to remind everyone that much of the great social progress that's been made over the last century or more has been because of freedom of speech. And that the speech that these movements that we might take for granted, we have to remember that at the time, the ideas were considered dangerous, they were considered offensive, and in some cases they were considered really traitorous. And I'm just going to do a quick sort of slideshow of images to remind us of how speech has been used. Whether that was in the early 1900s as a women, campaigned for the right to vote. Of course, the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, the anti-war effort, students protesting and burning draft cards, Stonewall, which was the beginning of the LGBTQ movement, which was gonna continue for decades to culminate in same-sex marriage being found to be constitutional by the US Supreme Court. We have more recent campaigns in progress, Dreamers, working with DACA students, fighting for their rights. We have issues that have to do with Me Too, Title IX, sexual violence. And of course, we have most recently Black Lives Matter protests. And I would posit that if we did not have free speech in our Constitution, the government would have shut down all of that type of activity. And in some cases, right, there's been a lot of problems with protesters not being able to have their full rights. And that's even in a system where we have the US Constitution. So I want to share this quote with you from Hugo Black, an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court for many years. I know this is a little like nerdy legal thing, but it's one of my favorite quotes, and it reads, "The framers of the Constitution knew that free speech is the friend of change and revolution, but they also knew that it is always the deadliest enemy of tyranny." And I think that's something to keep in mind. So listen, as Dr. Grills and I have both now talked about, hate speech hurts. There is a huge cost to be borne, and we know that the majority of hate speech is targeted against people that are in marginalized, vulnerable minority communities. And that is a very, very severe problem. And I think that sometimes we think to ourselves, it might be better if we could just censor certain speech so that we could stave off the pain. And I'm going to make the argument that I ultimately think that moving towards censorship actually ultimately will undermine diversity, inclusion, and equity. Now, there have been a lot of studies about this around the country and around the world, especially out of European countries that do censor speech. I picked an example from the United States and from a college campus because I think it has the most meaning. It's a story about the University of Michigan. So you may or may not know that in the 1980s, there was a movement to pass things called hate speech codes. They're exactly what you imagine. It was during a time where there was really a lot of hate and antipathy, and it was happening on college campuses in terms of rhetoric and language that was being used. And so campuses started passing these rules of conduct that said you are not allowed to say things that will be considered hurtful or harmful or offensive to people on campus. And the hate speech codes were ultimately challenged, and they were ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court. And the reason they were struck down by the Supreme Court goes back to my first question, which is why don't we have a definition of hate speech? Because it's too subjective. What the Supreme Court said was, you can't punish somebody for conduct that they don't know is wrong. And if you can't define what hateful speech is, then you can't punish people. But that's not the part I want to focus on. The part I want to focus on is the fact that while their free speech codes were on the books for a little less than 2 years, more than 20 Black students were charged with racist speech by white students. But there wasn't a single instance of a white student being punished for racist speech, even though that was what had prompted the drafting of the Michigan Speech Code in the first place. And of course, there's so many systems at work here in terms of bias, but I use this example because I think sometimes when people say, well, if we could just censor certain speech, then that would lead to the kind of climate that we want. I think we always have to be careful what we wish for. So that leads us really to the million-dollar question, which is, if hateful speech is permitted under the First Amendment, if LMU under Leonard law in California is covered by the First Amendment, what can we, and I mean we in the smallest and the biggest sense, we as individuals, we as classes, we as members of the community as a whole, we as affinity groups can do in response to hateful speech. And I realize that this is easier said than done. And I acknowledge that different people have different size platforms. Some people have microphones, some people have bullhorns, some people don't have either of those things to augment their voice. But flaws and all, I want to talk a little bit about empowering yourself and other campus stakeholders to speak out in the face of ugly words. Right now, I think what happens sometimes when people hear that hateful speech is protected, they kind of throw up their hands and they say, well, there's nothing we can do, so, and they just feel hopeless. And I think the truth is there may not be anything the law can do. So somebody who puts up a hateful poster or who brings an offensive speaker to campus, they're not going to be punished. But I think that when we look at the world of social norms and community values, I think that we have a lens through which to hold people responsible. And I think this idea of rights versus responsibilities is really key, right? Just because you're free to say whatever you want doesn't always mean you should. And I feel like that may seem very simplistic, but I feel like this is really at the heart of what creating a climate within a university where free speech is permitted and where values like anti-racism, diversity, inclusion, and other values are also priorities. So I think we're going to start with Loyola Marymount, and I will just say that in everything I've learned about your community since I started preparing to speak to you has made me wish that I went to Loyola Marymount. I think right now we are in a moment where there's a lot of leaders in universities and otherwise who are speaking a lot of words, but not followed by a lot of action. And the fact that you have such a robust turnout today, the fact that you have the president and other people coming together to discuss these issues, to me speaks to like really living the institutional values. And I think that these institutional values really encapsulate part of what free speech is about, which is using your voice in whatever way you choose in the service of faith and in the promotion of justice. So I want to give a couple of examples. Oh, first I want to do the pyramid of hate. This is courtesy of the Anti-Defamation League. I think it's a very powerful graphic. And the reason I use it is because I think sometimes when people think about having to use their voice, it becomes very overwhelming. And I want to showcase that really any speech that you can do, whether it's as the president of the university or whether it is as, you know, a student, whoever you are, there's an important role to play. And when you see this pyramid, you'll see that the base is wider. And then as we go up the pyramid, the layers become smaller. And what we start with is biased attitudes, stereotyping, insensitive remarks, fear of indifference, non-inclusive language. I can't see everybody right now, and I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but I'm guessing that everybody has encountered these kinds of remarks, if not directed towards you yourself, then towards someone else. And so the idea of the pyramid of hate is that if we don't step in at the lowest levels, when people are making jokes, when we're standing around the water cooler, maybe when someone's chatting during a Zoom class, then it elevates to acts of bias. And that's our next level: bullying, name calling, slurs, epithets, social avoidance. And if we don't intervene there, we get to forms of systematic discrimination: economic, political, educational, employment, housing, and of course our criminal justice system that has tremendous disparities. And then we continue up and we move sort of from civil things to criminal, bias motivated violence, also known as hate crimes. And then at the very top of the pyramid is genocide. And unfortunately, there are too many genocides to list, and there really should be none. And so when I ask people to think about how to use their voice, I ask people to think about the pyramid and to think that if we can start to take out, if the pyramid, let's say, is made of stones, and we can take out the stones at the bottom, if we can take out the microaggressions, if we can take out accepting negative or misinformation, screening out positive information, stereotyping, then the idea is that the pyramid would fall. And I realize that this is a very idealized version of how things can work, but I think that it is true. And I want to give a couple of examples in school contexts of how one might use their voice to respond to hateful speech. In this case, I'm thinking more of a high-level administrator. Let's say, whatever, there's a viral video that goes, you know, live, or there's somebody who hangs up a really hateful flyer, or there's someone who's coming to campus that has really hateful ideas. You want to respond to constitutionally protected instances of hate or bias with direct, clear, and timely statements. Timely is really important. We live in this 24/7 world. You can't let grass grow under your feet, right? We have to let people know right away that we understand that what was said does not contravenes our institutional values. The hate has to be named. I can't tell you how many statements I have seen in response to something. Let's say it was like an anti-Muslim flyer, where the response just talks about hate being bad in general. That's not enough. You have to speak to the specific community that is being targeted and offer them resources and recourse. And then there's leadership and moral clarity. And I think this goes not just for campus leaders, but all leaders. And that's really key. As students, I've picked out a couple of examples here. At the center that I am the executive director of, we have fellows. And one of the fellows this past year did an amazing, basically ethnographic study of UCSB and how all the ways in the last like 4 or 5 years, they've kind of marshaled their resources to respond to hate. And so I wanted to choose 2 of these examples. The first one you see here is actually from 2016 when they first started this campaign, which is #HateFreeUCSB. On the back of the shirts, it says exclusion is ignorance. And you know, wearing these shirts provided a visible and unifying response to hate on campus and helped people take a stance both individually and collectively. And then they continued that campaign even into 2017. Ben Shapiro, many of you know, is a conservative speaker that has a lot of very offensive ideas. He was coming to campus, and in response, they distributed these stickers, hashtag hate-free UCSB. They actually stood out in the pouring rain at a little kiosk and gave out stickers to people on the days before Shapiro was visiting. And it was part of a campaign to kind of move the attention away from Ben Shapiro, because speakers like that want attention, and to try to focus on the message and the values of the community. Then the last example that I want to leave you with is one that actually comes from our hometown in Los Angeles, from UCLA. It has to do with the UCLA Bruin Republicans. And the Bruin Republicans had decided they were going to invite Milo Yiannopoulos, who is a infamous provocateur. And the club had sort of an informal faculty advisor. And this faculty advisor wrote a letter in the UCLA paper that read as follows. As one of the few conservative faculty at UCLA and one of a very few who knows the campus club, I feel obligated to provide some mentorship here. Strongly urge you to rescind your invitation to Yiannopoulos. Allow me to explain why. The most important reason not to host such a talk is that it is evil on the merits. Your conscience should tell you that you never want anything to do with someone whose entire career is not reasoned argument, but shock jock performance art. He continued, if you go through with hosting Yiannopoulos, I will vociferously support your right to do so and the duty of the UCPD to use force if necessary to maintain order and prevent a heckler's veto. However, I must just as vehemently and publicly disagree with your decision to host him. So here we see that reference to rights versus responsibilities. And the faculty member closes out by saying, should the event go forward, I will decline to have any association with the Bruin Republicans until it has experienced a complete turnover in membership. I hope that will not be the case and that I can continue to support you. So you will see, I think this plays out some of the themes that I've been trying to get at, which is that there are rights under the First Amendment, but we have choices about what we say or who we bring to campus or how we express ourselves, and that there are consequences to our speech. And I think it was tremendous that this faculty member in a very public way was able to step in and show some mentorship and guidance, saying, you can do what you want, it is your right, but here are the reasons why I think you're making a poor choice. And the club ultimately rescinded the invitation to Milo. I don't know if it was because of this letter or other reasons, but I think this is a very effective example of how speech can work in the face of hateful ideology. It doesn't always work. My last point before I wrap up is this idea, the faculty member mentioned a heckler's veto. And I feel like we can't talk about free speech right now without talking about this idea of a heckler's veto. So what is a heckler's veto? A heckler's veto is when you're so disruptive that the protesters preclude the speaker from being heard. And I think we have our last poll on this question, which is the heckler's veto permissible under the Constitution? So is it constitutional for you to stand while someone is speaking and scream so loud or jump up and down or throw confetti, whatever it is that you're going to do, that the listener cannot hear the speaker? And while you're voting, I'm going to tell you that this tactic of shouting down a speaker because one does not like what that speaker has to say has become increasingly popular on college campuses. And I'm going to end the poll. And we have, yes, 71% of people think a heckler's veto is permissible and 29% think it's not. And again, I think this is one of the misunderstandings about the First Amendment. Protest is absolutely allowed. It is essential. But when the protest becomes so vociferous and so loud that the speaker can't talk, and more importantly, the audience isn't able to hear the speaker, then you've crossed beyond protected protest into something that's unconstitutional. Now, it's a very fine line, and again, I wish we had more time to discuss when is something protest and when it's not, but I think you can imagine, right? Wearing t-shirts, standing up, walking out during a speech, holding posters during a speech, distributing information, but if you stand up and basically yell and say, I'm gonna stand here and yell until this speaker stops talking, that is no longer constitutional. And again, I would argue that ultimately trying to shut down or censor speech is going to be to the detriment of everyone, and including the values that I think all of us hold very dear. So again, heckler's veto is not protected because it infringes on the right of the speaker, and we also need to remember the right of the audience. So I'm trying to keep to my time. I started with this quote: we begin at the beginning and we go on till you come to the end and then you stop. And what I want to end by saying is that there is no end, that this story is one that continues to be written. And I want to posit that I think everybody in the LMU community has an opportunity to write part of this story, and that perhaps we can change some of the enduring legacies, you know, that have emanated from the Constitution. And I think in this moment of, you know, fighting for social justice and making sure that we speak up as anti-racist individuals and institutions, there is a lot of work to be done. I will just end by saying that it's been such a privilege to be able to share some thoughts with this group. It's very inspirational to be part of a forum where hundreds of people have actually come together because this is what their community is about and this is what it means to them. I'm imagining that between what Dr. Grills said and what I said, you'll have a lot to discuss in your breakout groups. I'm always available as a resource, happy to talk with you about these issues. I'm happy to forward along information about our center and the work that the fellows do. But for now, I'm just gonna bid you adieu and say thank you and turn it over to Taylor Pinen, one of the intercultural facilitators at LMU. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much to both Dr. Grills and Dr. Deutchman. Those presentations definitely are making me think a lot, and I imagine everyone else in the audience as well. Like Dr. Deutchman was saying, my name is Taylor Pinen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior double majoring in anti-racism studies and Spanish. I'm also an intercultural facilitator, and I'm super glad to put on my new cardigan. It's been a long time. And I'm also the president of TEAM, and that's a white anti-racist affinity group. And if you have any questions about any of these groups, I'd love to talk with you further after this. Also, we are going to be heading into breakout sessions, and I'm gonna lead you in some community guidelines before we do that. And I want to set up these guidelines so that we have a foundation to fall back on if and or when we run into difficulties, as conversations around hard topics like this can be uncomfortable and challenging. So here are a few guidelines to prepare you all for your discussions. So the first one that we have is step up, step back. If you find yourself kind of nervous to say anything, or you're sitting back in your breakout room, I am inviting you to push yourself and speak up. But on the other hand, if you find yourself dominating the conversation, step back and let others have the floor to speak. The second guideline we have is actively listen. We're here to learn and grow together. So if you notice yourself starting to feel very defensive, or you just want to argue, ask yourself, am I listening to listen, or am I just listening to respond? Because there's a very big difference between those two. The third guideline is recognize intent versus impact. Though we're all coming in to these breakout rooms with good intentions, I imagine, sometimes it really doesn't matter what our intentions are if we hurt others. So while we are going to push ourselves to speak up, I want you all to be cognizant of how we word things and just think before you speak. And then the fourth and final one that we have is big for today, and it's accept and expect that we won't have time to address all of this. We aren't going to be in the breakout rooms for that long, so I invite you to continue this conversation with your friends, with your family, after this event. So we're going to send you into the rooms now, and you'll have about 20 minutes to discuss the questions that we're going to put in the chat right now. And also, about 3 minutes before we are going to end the breakout rooms, we are going to put a link into the chat, and for that, we want you to submit keywords that were a part of your conversations, and you can submit those through the link in the chat. And we encourage your entire group to submit multiple words, one word at a time. And when we come back from the small groups, we will have time to discuss what we talked about in the chats, and then also these keywords. So we're going to put you in the chat right now, and have fun and follow again.
I am ASLMU's Director of Free Speech and Expression, as well as co-editor for Agency. And I just want to thank all of you guys for attending this forum. This is basically the end, but I wanted to lead you guys off with a quick message from our student leaders. So give me a second to pull up that video.
I exhibit free speech by prioritizing the needs of myself and my community and speaking out about those before addressing the needs of an institution.
I think the most obvious way is by being involved in student journalism, which is very new to me. I just joined Agency, which is the independent student-run newspaper on campus. And I think that the environment that's created at Agency really empowers us to talk about literally anything, talk about topics that may seem controversial, but are actually super beneficial for our growth and our learning as a community.
For me, free speech on campus looks like students being able to say what they want and how they feel without fear that their rights will be taken away.
I see free speech in Agency's independent reporting for the students and by the students.
To me, freedom of speech means not only having the freedom to express oneself, but also the freedom to speak with speech that is free from hate and harm towards others. To me, those two freedoms are what make freedom of speech different, free speech different from hate speech.
I see free speech in Black at LMU's recent demands for change against systemic anti-Blackness.
Last fall semester, it was very inspiring witnessing Sodexo workers protest and demand that their voices be heard.
I see free speech in my own organization, which I'm representing CRIME, which is a student-run coalition for queer students of color to be cared for radically.
Utilizing free speech as a method of saying hateful things does not exonerate anyone from the consequences that might arise from said hate speech, whether those consequences be institutional or otherwise.
I think the most common way of talking about topics and social justice issues has been sharing and reposting infographics right now on Instagram and other social media platforms, which I think is more popular now than ever, and I think it's a great way for students to show what they believe in.
To me, freedom of speech is incredibly important on college campuses because it's a privilege that doesn't exist in many places in the world, and we have a responsibility and a duty to use it to the best of our ability. Thanks for listening.
Alrighty, thank you so much, you guys, for attending this forum. I wanted to uplift and thank all of our speakers for their wisdom and their knowledge, and thank you guys for taking your time to be on this Zoom call for a very important conversation that has to be had and has to continue to happen. But before I let you guys go, I want to share some Instagrams of some student-led organizations because I would like everyone to kind of stay tuned with what students are doing and to maintain awareness of what's going on campus. And then I will put that in the chat, and then I will turn over to President Snyder to wrap us all up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. May I proceed? I don't need to wait, do I?
You're good.
Pop those to the chat. Thank you. Everybody can cut those and paste them because when the Zoom disappears, they may go. Robin, thank you for that inspiring call to action. I also thank Dr. Grills. I thank Dr. Deutchman for their insights. I learned a lot today. I'm sure that each of us did. I thank each of you for joining us today. I value your service to LMU as part of that to your community, to our community, and of course, to one another and then the wider world. I hope that indeed what we learned we can take together so that we can strengthen LMU, specifically become proactively anti-racist and really work together for the benefit of all, as I love to say, for those here, for those to come, and for the earth itself. Bless each of you. And anytime these days I have to ask you, please do all you can to stay safe. You're worth it.